Some years ago when I was in school, it wasn't uncommon on Thursday night to hear a fella that I knew making phone calls trying to get a date for Saturday night. And he would do it sort of like this. He would call up a girl and he'd say, "Cynthia, this is Bill." He said, "I've already called Judy, but she's going to be out of town Saturday night. And so I called Susan, and she's busy. I called Ann. She couldn't go. So, Cynthia, I just wondered whether or not you'd like to go out on a date." Now, needless to say, Bill didn't get a lot of dates, because girls don't like to hear that they're second or third or fourth or last choice. And none of us do. In the old comic strip, Charlie Brown, one time, or Peanut, somebody said to Charlie Brown, "Charlie Brown, winning is not everything." Charlie Brown said, "No," but he said, "losing isn't anything. There's nothing to lose." We just don't like to be in second place. Factory seconds don't bring as much money as first run material. Being runner-up, that's nice, but it's not as good as being in first place. Consolation prizes just don't have the same glitter to them. Most of us have an emotional surge when someone says you're pretty good, but you're in second place. I would suggest to you it wouldn't be too smart for any of the husbands here tonight to go home and say, "Honey, you are the second best looking woman down there at that church." I just wouldn't suggest that you do that. That's not too smart. But you know, sometimes good things, great things, can happen with seconds and second choices. Most of you know and have heard, have watched and seen the picture, the famous picture of Whistler's mother. Whistler was obviously a painter. You know that because of the famous picture called Whistler's Mother. Does anybody know what his first name was? It was James. James Whistler. You might be interested to know that James Whistler didn't want to be a painter. He wanted to be a chemist. And he actually went to West Point and he flunked out of chemistry. Didn't do well at it at all. So he said, "I'm going to be an engineer." He didn't do too well at that either. And so he finally, as last choice or third choice, decided, "I'll see if I can paint, if I can be an artist." And he made his mark and fame by being a painter. And you know about his painting, but that was third choice. Third choice. I read that Sir Walter Scott was on the scene the same time that Lord Byron was. And the burning ambition of Sir Walter Scott was to be a great poet, but he couldn't hold a candle to Lord Byron. So he changed over from poetry to prose, and he started writing prose, and he wrote all these novels, but he was embarrassed. He was ashamed that it wasn't poetry. And so he didn't even use his real name. He used a pseudonym. But before long, folks started liking these books, and so he put his actual name on subsequent writings. And many of his works have endured time and are known as great literary works. But that wasn't his first choice. It was his second choice. Seems to me things in life, sometimes wonderful things, seem to happen with second choices. I actually sort of got the idea for this sermon from one of your elders, Aaron, last Sunday night. He didn't know that. We were visiting, and he was talking about things that seem like they're not the first choice, but they work out really, really well sometimes. And I got to thinking about that. The Bible is full of examples of second choices. Second choices that just seem to flourish. I even got to thinking, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. That wouldn't be smart. But I wonder how many of you here tonight, men and women, how many of you may have married your second choice? Now, again, I'm not asking you to reveal that. But it could be that it worked out much, much better than if you had married your first choice. Well, that's the hook. I've set the hook because I want to try to talk for a few minutes tonight about second choices. One of them was mentioned in the prayer a while ago, Joseph. If you open up your Old Testament and you read about a man named Joseph, Joseph was a favorite son. He was envied, despised by his brothers. Genesis chapter 37. Joseph was told in a dream that he was going to do great things for God. God revealed it to him very early. He was going to serve God in a capacity that nobody else could, nobody else had. So Joseph, you're going to be a great leader for God. Had we been able to ask Joseph at that moment, after that dream, if you'd said, Joseph, what is your first choice for serving God? Would you like to do it as a free man right here in your home country? Would you like to be able to do it with a lot of support and a lot of help and a lot of acclamation from everyone else? Or would you rather do it as a slave, sold into bondage, into a foreign land? We don't even have to be psychic to know what Joseph's answer would have been. It would have been, I'd rather do it right here. I'd rather do it at home. I'd rather do it as a free man right here in my father's house. I could serve God better that way. God said, that's wonderful, Joseph. You get your second choice. You don't get your first choice. You get your second choice. And he was sold into Egyptian slavery by his own brothers. He went down to the land of Egypt. He lived there as a slave. He was in the house of a man named Potiphar, captain of the king's guard, but he's still in slavery. Think about it, though. At that point, if you'd have come and said, okay, Joseph, we're going to give you another choice. You can choose again. Would you rather serve God in this wonderful capacity right here in Potiphar's house? Potiphar is an important man in Egypt. You've got a good job. You're treated well. Would you rather stay right here or you want to be thrown into prison? You want to be lied about and your name slandered and thrown into prison. Well, he would have said, well, I believe I'd rather stick with what I've got. I'd rather stay right here. Again, God said, okay, you get your second choice. And because you know the story, Potiphar's wife wanted Joseph, and Joseph had enough scruples about him, enough allegiance, not only to Potiphar, but to God. He said, I can't do this terrible thing. I can't sin against God. And she lied about him, and he was thrown into jail, into the innermost part of the prison, and there he was, locked up. We'd look at that and say, wow, in the world, how is he going to serve God like that? God said, Joseph, you've been selected to be my man. How's he going to do this? Well, you know, he interprets the dreams that are had by those that were in prison. And I don't have time to go through all of it, but he is restored. He's turned loose from the jail, and he becomes the number 2 man in all of Egypt because he could interpret Pharaoh's dream. The day finally came that it turned out well for him. And every man and every woman this evening, we profit because Joseph was not only able to deliver himself from that prison, he was able to redeem the whole household of Jacob that became the nation of Israel, that saved the family, the tribes, and ultimately incubated Jesus Christ and brought him into the world. And so we enjoy that benefit as Christians tonight. But it's because he got his second choices, not his first. There's another man in the Old Testament, a leader that we think of, named Moses. Moses was born in a period of treacherous times, again, down in the land of Egypt. The Israelites had fallen into slavery during those 400 years they were down there after Joseph died. God calls Moses to be born into the world. When Moses is born, Exodus chapter 2 records the story. His mother put him in the ark of the bulrushes, put him out there in the Nile River. They were killing all of the male children of the Israelites that were born of that time. None of them could survive. And it was in this setting Moses was born, floating down there in the Nile River. If he'd been old enough to been a boy with his own will and his own ability to make a decision, if you'd have been able to go up to Moses at that time when he was floating in that little ark of the bulrushes and said, "Now, Moses, where would you rather be raised? You rather be raised in the palace of Pharaoh with all of its blessings and all of the privileges, or would you rather be raised by your own mother and be brought up as an Israelite child and hear all of the stories and live the traditions that were already established and others that would come as an Israelite? Which one would you rather do?" I have every feeling tonight, given the choice, I believe in spite of all the advantages, all of the education, all of the money that could be his, I think Moses would have said, "I'd rather be with my own mother." Because that's the very choice he makes later in life. Later in life, he makes the choice to stick up for the Israelite that's being beaten by the Egyptian. And he gives all of his allegiance to the Israelite people. Years later, having had that ingrained to him, he knew all of the stories, all the plans of God. They were put into his heart by his own mother, who served as his nursemaid. He knew who he was. He knew where he was going. He knew what his purpose in life was. You know, God could have come to him and said, "Now, Moses, what do you want to do now? You're 40 years old. Would you rather deliver the people of Israel now, or you want to wait 40 years? You want to wait till you're 80 years old?" I know what the answer to that would have been too. Moses was ready to fight then. That's when he killed the Egyptian that was beating up on the Israelite. He was ready to go. He was ready to stick up for his own people. But God said, "Not yet. Not yet, Moses." And because of that fight and that killing, he had to flee into the land of Midian. God said, "I've got things for you to do out there, Moses." He goes out there in the land of Midian. He gets married, has children, and he stayed out there for 40 more years. 40 years. But he did something else. He was a shepherd. And he learned what it was like during that 40 years to live the life of a shepherd. During that 40 years, he learned where all of the watering holes were. He learned where all the shelters were. He learned that region. He learned that land, so that when he came back to Egypt at 80 years of age, and he came into the presence of Pharaoh, he had had all of this great preparation. He wasn't ready 40 years earlier. But now he has the experience. He has the wisdom. He has the knowledge of a shepherd. And he knows those trails. He knows those watering holes. So God got him ready to do shepherding work. So he spends 40 more years piled on top of a man that's already 40. He comes back at 80 years old to lead God's people. Once again, I think had God given him a choice, said, "Okay, Moses, you're back. It's time. You're going to lead the Israelite nation? 600,000 fighting men? What's that? 1.5 million? 2 million people maybe? You're going to lead this great mass of folks and lead them to freedom? Would you rather go on into the promised land now, or would you rather wait 40 more years? Well, you know what his answer would have been. I'm ready to go. Show me where that land is that flows with milk and honey. Of course, I want to go in now. God said, okay, good. You're going to get your second choice. You seeing a pattern here? You're not going to get your choice. But they got out there and got to Sinai and had the giving of the law. And because the people weren't ready to go in, the people were murmuring and griping and complaining and wavering in their faith. And God said, you're going to wander 38 more years. They'd been out there 2 years by that time, a total of 40 years more in the wilderness before you go in. So he has to wait another 40 years, and then he doesn't get to go in. He dies before he goes. But great things occurred. Great things for God happened because he didn't get his first choice. But he continued getting his second choice. Well, that's the Old Testament. You say that's back there. What about the New Testament? And all I have to do is mention one name. The Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul. Paul had such an interesting life and such an impressive life. Paul went, as you know, from persecutor to preacher. Seemed like overnight when he had his conversion experience along the way on the road to Damascus. But even after he was converted, after Saul of Tarsus is in the background and Paul, the great evangelist, the great teacher, springs forth, he's going out and he's doing great missionary efforts. When we get to Acts chapter 16, there comes a time in Acts 16 when he's making his way through that giant province of Galatia. He makes his way along and he decides, I believe I'm going to turn aside. I believe I'm going to go this way. My first choice, Paul would say, would be to go to Bithynia and preach over there. He said, that's what I choose. The Holy Spirit said, no. He said, well, I believe I'll go this way then. Holy Spirit said, no. Finally, the only thing that was left was a path that led straight to Troas. And so Paul goes to Troas. This was definitely his second choice. He gets there, and in the night he has a dream, and a vision to the dream, and he saw a man in Macedonia. And the man in Macedonia said, come over and help us. Come over here and help us. This is Acts 16, verse 9. So Paul made that trip across the sea. He went into the continent of Europe, and he took the gospel message to Europe. Thanks be to God this evening as we stand here, he did it that way. Thanks be to God he didn't get his first choice, that he didn't turn back into Asia. For Asia has been overrun by the Muslim faith, but he went to Europe. He went to Europe and he established churches and did preaching there. And it was from the shores of Europe that our ancestors came to America. And they brought to this new land of faith from Europe. Today, we stand in the biblical tradition here because Paul didn't get his first choice, but he got his second choice. His second choice worked out so well because God had great plans for it. Later on, Paul one time said, Lord, I want to go to Rome. When he writes to the book of Romans, the letter to the Romans, he says, I'm wanting to come to you. I want to come that I can impart a spiritual gift to you. I want to see you. And he wants to go. Now again, if God had said, Paul, what's your choice? You want to go to Rome as your own man? You want a first class ticket that you can ride in comfort? You want to be able to go to the synagogue and do as you've always done, I'll be able to get up and with respect, the respect people are giving you, that you could stand up and preach. Is that how you'd like to do it, Paul, or you want to go as a prisoner? You want to go in chains, be limited to a hired house, maybe to a Roman soldier. Which way would you rather do it? Well, there's no choice there. Say, Lord, if it's all the same to you, I'd like to go as a free man. Once again, God said, no. No, you're going to get your second choice. You're going to go as a prisoner. They captured him in Jerusalem. They lied about him in Jerusalem. Tried to assassinate him. They put him in prison. Finally, his only defense was he had to appeal to Caesar. I'm a Roman citizen. I have the right to appeal to Caesar. So they sent him to Rome. He goes to Rome, but he goes not the way he had planned to, but he goes as a prisoner through a lot of hazards, shipwrecks, all kinds of disastrous things happened to him. But he did make it to Rome. But he was chained to a soldier. He was kept in his own hired house. Couldn't move around like he wanted to. He was trapped. No doubt Paul probably thought, I could do so much more. I could have so much more of an impact if I was free. But it's a wonderful thing tonight to be able to open up our Bibles and read in Philippians chapter 1 as Paul talks about his life. Philippians 1, he says, I want you to know, brethren, this is verse 12. He says, I want you to know that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Did you hear that? Paul looks back and says, this really advanced it, really helped. He said, of all these terrible things that I thought were destroying me, they all worked out for good. Then he says in verses 13 and 14, he says, as a result, it's become clear through the whole palace guard, this is the Praetorian Guard, and to everyone else that I'm in chains for Christ. Because of my chains, most of the brothers in the Lord have been encouraged to speak the word of God more courageously and fearlessly. He said the other brethren, they are more courageous, more fearless, and they're preaching better than they ever have because of my chains. Then he goes on and he says, the palace guard, this is Caesar's guard. He says, even the palace guards, some have been faithful. I don't know. I'm guessing he was probably chained to a Roman guard during the daytime. How would you like to be chained to a preacher 8 or 10 hours a day? A preacher who loved words and liked to use them and liked to talk and wanted to preach and wanted to sing, and you had to sit there and be chained to, couldn't get away from it. You talk about a captive audience. He had a captive audience. And no doubt this is why some of them were faithful and became members of the Lord's church. And Paul says it all happened. It all happened. Verse 22 of chapter 4, he says they've been convinced, they've been converted, and all the saints send you greetings, especially those who belong to the Caesar's household. Paul had to say, I never thought it would happen like that. I never dreamed it would work out like this. All of these second choices, they turned out to be the greatest plan that God ever made. A better plan than he could have ever come up with on his own. You say, what's your point? Here's the point. Probably I might, if I had to be sitting where you're sitting and critique this sermon, I'd probably say there's not but one point. Here it is. It seems to me that about the only thing we can know for sure about the providence of God in advance is to have faith in it. Can I say that again? About the only thing that we can know for sure about the providence of God in advance is to have faith in it. And to remember that all things do work together for good, for them that love the Lord, are called to His purpose. And that on this side of it, we can't always see how wonderful things are really going to come out. But what we can do is we have to be confident. We have to have faith. We can't see it. We're stuck here in this ditch. We say, why have we had to take this detour? Seems like we're wasting time. Seems like this is getting us further from our goal, and we can't understand it. And we say, Lord, if I had a second choice, this would certainly have to be it. Why is it going this way? God says, I'm sorry, you get your second choice. And we got to walk the road of the second choice with confidence, with faith. For Paul says we walk by faith, not by sight. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7. That's the only way. Then, down the road, later, we can look back. And when we look back, we can see what Joseph saw. Joseph said to his brothers, said, you sold me into Egypt. You meant it for evil, but he said, now I see, now I understand. God meant it for good. We'll be able to do what Moses did. We can say, God, I didn't understand why we had to do it this way, but now I see. I wasn't ready. I needed to be ready. I needed to learn the job, the role of shepherd. I need to be gotten ready so I could lead. And he says, I understand it now. I understand it because I learned some things that were so vitally important to me in that middle section, that middle 40 years that helped me the last 40 years of my life. We can look back someday and we can stand in the shoes of Paul like he stood in Rome and say, now I see, now I understand that instead of these things destroying the gospel, he said they have fallen out for the progress, the advancement of the gospel. Ladies and gentlemen, the day will come when we'll be able to make similar statements about our second choices. And we'll be able to look back and say, it's not what I would have picked. I didn't necessarily enjoy it. It wasn't a wonderful time. But I now see how it really worked out for good. And I would suggest that God sometimes does the same thing for congregations, for churches. Sometimes through second choices. I could give you a lot of examples. For time's sake, I don't have that time, but you've lived long enough, most of you, to have experienced the same things. Sometimes as a church, does He send us on a course that seems far, far afield of where we want to go and where we think we ought to be going and where it seems like we ought to wind up? No doubt He does. Are there times we wish it could be different? Of course. Are there times that we say, I just wish things hadn't have happened that have happened? Sure we do. Is it to continually happen to teach us things? To teach us to have confidence, to have faith, to believe in patience, to believe that God is working some great things out, which leads me back to my one point for the evening. Even with churches, with congregations, about the only thing that we can be sure of about the providence of God in advance is to have faith in it. To have faith in it. To believe in it. To believe that He is, in fact, in control. He is, in fact, taking care of us. And He does, in fact, work all things together for good. One day, we can stand, we'll look back, we'll say, now I get it. Now I understand it. I didn't back then. I didn't understand why it was happening then, but now I can see that God was pushing us, testing us, trying us, making us stronger all the time. Didn't like it. Wasn't happy about it. But now I can see that God knew what we needed. God knew the course to put us on. God can work great things in individuals. He can work great things in congregations with second choices. But there is one first choice He wants all of us to make. And that is, He wants us to put Jesus Christ first. Above everything else, anybody else, all else. First. You have that opportunity tonight to do that. And I can't think of a better moment to encourage you than right now as we stand and as we sing.
Let's rise up.